He was born in a humble town of stone walls and rolling Umbrian hills, a place both lively and pious, where church bells tolled morning and night, and the sun's warmth dappled vineyards and meadows. The town was Assisi, perched on a hill like a watchful sentinel overlooking the valley below. Though no one could have guessed it at the time, this child, born around the year of our Lord 1181 or 1182, would one day become a transformative figure in Christendom, drawing people's hearts back to a simplicity and ardor they had almost forgotten. His father was Pietro de Bernardone, a prosperous cloth merchant of considerable ambition. Pietro was not a man of great breeding or noble blood, but in commerce he found his calling and his pride. Travelling from Assisi to France and back, dealing in fine fabrics and woolens, he carried with him both an eye for quality and a desire to climb upward in society. His mother was Pica, a gentle, deeply devout woman of Provençal origins, quieter in temperament than her husband, yet possessed of a strong inner conviction. When her labor pains came in the midst of Pietro's absence on one of his business journeys, the people of their household hustled to and fro, calling for midwives, offering up prayers, and burning candles to ward away any ill fortune. At last the child came, a wriggling, red-cheeked boy. Pica wanted to name the boy Giovanni after John the Baptist, in the hope that the child would inherit the Baptist spirit of fervent devotion. And indeed, the baby was baptized as Giovanni. But Pietro, upon returning from France, insisted that he be called Francesco, in homage to the land he so admired. It was a trivial enough squabble, names for an infant boy, each parent wishing to bestow a certain identity, but it foreshadowed something of Francis's life, a tension between worldly ambition and spiritual yearning. In the decades ahead, that tension would play out with consequences neither parent could have possibly foreseen. In his earliest years, the boy Francis was neither saint nor ascetic. He was, by all accounts, a lively child who thrived in the gentle climate and bustling environment of Assisi. He took pleasure in the squares where merchants displayed their wares, in the winding stone alleys that seemed so full of secrets, in the small orchard behind his family home where he would chase after birds with boyish glee. He was not an especially bookish child, nor did he exhibit the solemnity one might associate with future holiness. Rather, Francis spent his days laughing, playing games of mock warfare with his friends, and running through the fields outside the city gates whenever he managed to slip away from parental supervision. His father's wealth ensured that he was never short of fine clothes or an abundance of food. His mother's gentleness ensured that he knew love and tenderness, that he felt the quiet comfort of prayers whispered by lamplight. Yet the demands of commerce took Pietro away for weeks or months at a time, leaving Francis to be raised largely by household servants and in his moral instruction by local priests who taught him the basic prayers of the Church. He learned the Our Father and the Ave Maria. He was told about Jesus Christ, who was both God and man, a mystery that caused Francis great wonder whenever he paused his endless chatter long enough to reflect. He was a bright boy, though not necessarily prone to extended study. Life's delights sparkled too strongly before him, and the notion of devoting himself to dusty tomes seemed, at that point, dreadfully dull. As Francis reached his teens, his energy found expression in revelry. He had a cheerful nature that others found charming, and he possessed sufficient family wealth to indulge in festivities. He became known as something of a ringleader among the youth of Assisi. They would gather for feasts and parties, turning the nights into music and song, with Francis often footing the bill. He made friends easily. There was a magnetism about him that drew people close. Money flowed freely from his pockets, which Pietro viewed with mixed emotions. He was proud of his son's popularity, but wary of Francis becoming a wastrel. Francis earned the informal title of the King of Revels, an ironic moniker for one who would eventually preach about the ephemeral nature of all earthly pleasures. At the time, the notion of rejecting worldly wealth was unimaginable to him. He enjoyed spending his father's money on lavish feasts. He loved new fashion, even if it was flamboyant. Life was sweet, and he intended to savor it. Yet even during these carefree years, something tugged at Francis's heart. During one especially raucous celebration, when the wine had been flowing and laughter ricocheted off the walls, a pause overcame him. He looked around at the bright faces of his friends, at the table laden with meats and bread, at the finery of the clothing. A wave of disquiet passed through him, brief but penetrating. It was a sense that beneath the merriment lay a hollowness that these festivities could not fill. Just as quickly, the feeling vanished, replaced by the cheerful teasing of a friend. Francis laughed it off and turned back to the banquet, but the experience lodged somewhere deep inside him. When he was around 20 years of age, conflict broke out between Assisi and the neighboring city of Perugia. Ambitious, naive in the ways of war, Francis eagerly took up arms, longing to prove himself as a knight. This was another expression of that worldly quest for honor and renown. Donning armor that his father had reluctantly paid for, he rode out with other Assisi youths, heads filled with daydreams of heroism on the battlefield. But actual warfare proved different from the romantic legends. In a skirmish near the Ponte San Giovanni, Francis found himself trapped amid the chaos and quickly captured by Perugian forces. Many Assisi soldiers were killed. Francis was one of the lucky ones, merely taken prisoner and hauled off to a dank cell. It was a year of captivity, cramped quarters, scarce food, cruel words from guards, and the kind of slow, creeping despair that only the imprisoned truly know. Some nights, Francis would try to lift his fellow prisoners' spirits with jokes or spontaneous songs, clinging to the camaraderie of men who shared his plight. But in the shadows of the prison, doubts and fears stalked him. He was frail in constitution, and sickness visited him often, leaving him feverish and trembling. Still, he never lost his hope. He clung to a certain belief that something greater was in store for him, that he was meant for more than a miserable death in a Perugian prison. After nearly a year of negotiation and ransom, he was finally released. He returned to Assisi, pale and weak, his once boisterous spirit subdued by the ordeal. Pica fussed over him, providing warm meals and gentle embraces. Pietro scolded him for his folly, yet quietly rejoiced that his son was alive. During convalescence, Francis drifted in and out of fevered dreams. He had fitful visions of grand palaces filled with suits of armor marked with the cross. In these dreams, he felt called to go out into the world for some noble purpose, though the details remained vague. The illusions stirred his imagination. Encouraged by these fleeting images of chivalry, he resolved to join another military expedition, this time in Apulia, where a nobleman was said to be assembling an army. Unbeknownst to Francis, the call that would eventually claim his soul was not the summons of earthly warfare, but rather a summons of a different kind, one that would slowly become clear. Fully recovered from his earlier imprisonment, Francis set off again in pursuit of knighthood. But he did not make it far. In Spoleto, he was again struck by fever. Alone in the quiet hours of the night, he experienced a strange voice within his mind. "Francis, who can do more for you, the master or the servant?" He responded in his half-lucid state, "The master, of course." The voice then asked, "Why then do you abandon the master for the servant?" The words confounded him. He felt something stir inside, an urging to let go of the quest for worldly glory. By dawn, he decided to abandon his journey. He returned to Assisi, carrying with him a sense that God was calling him to a different path. Back home, the change in Francis did not manifest all at once. Outwardly, he remained affable, a friend to many, still wearing handsome clothes and socializing. Inwardly, though, a profound restlessness grew. The amusements that once captivated him no longer had the same hold. He found himself slipping into churches in the early morning hours, when only a few candles flickered and the air was cool. He would kneel in silence, a posture new to him, listening for some voice that might guide him. He lit candles and felt a subtle warmth in his soul, some presence that he could not fully name. At times, he experienced a wave of emotion that brought tears to his eyes without any clear reason. Something new was being born in him. One day he decided to make a pilgrimage to Rome. Part curiosity, part devotion, and part yearning, he traveled to the Eternal City, threading his way through dusty roads filled with merchants and fellow pilgrims. The trip itself was educational, as Francis witnessed the scale of poverty that existed beyond his relatively sheltered life. Beggars lined the roads outside Rome, limbs twisted by disease or missing altogether. Their eyes were hungry, less for food, perhaps, than for any scrap of human dignity. In Rome, Francis visited St. Peter's Basilica, gazed upon the tomb of the apostles, and was struck by the grandeur and wealth displayed in this seat of Christian power. Yet in the shadows, the poor huddled, some dressed in little more than rags. He was moved by compassion in a way he had never experienced. One story recounts how he exchanged clothes with a beggar, giving the man his own fine garments, then sitting near the door of the basilica, dressed in tatters, begging for alms with the rest. The day was humiliating, but also illuminating. People who had once passed by with a smile or a neutral expression looked upon him differently, some with pity, others with indifference or even disgust. He felt firsthand the sting of rejection, the vulnerability of being stripped of wealth and status. Something in him shattered that day, an old identity. Though he returned eventually to Assisi in his regular attire, a new tenderness had awakened in him, a drive to align himself with the least of these. Back in Assisi, Francis's prayers became more frequent, more fervent. He sought solitude in run-down chapels near the town. One such place was the small chapel of San Damiano, which stood just outside the walls of Assisi. It was a simple structure, largely abandoned, its walls crumbling, the altar neglected. One afternoon, Francis entered the church, drawn perhaps by the silence. Before him hung a crucifix, an icon in the Byzantine style, bearing the form of Christ not in abject agony, but in a regal and serene pose, eyes open, as if gazing into the soul of the onlooker. Francis knelt before it, his heart heavy with longing. He had been wrestling with an inner urge, unsure how to respond. His lips moved in prayer, quietly at first, and then tears began to flow. He asked the Lord for clarity, for a sign of what to do with his life. In that stillness, he heard a voice that resonated not just in his ears, but in the core of his being. "Francis, go and repair my house, which, as you can see, is falling into ruin." Astonished, Francis looked up at the crucifix. He would later describe how the lips of Christ seemed to move, how the voice sounded both gentle and firm. Whether audible or interior, it was real enough to him, and its command set him into motion. Taking the words in a literal sense, he resolved to fix the chapel of San Damiano. He did not initially understand that "repair my house" had broader implications, referring to the church itself in a time when spiritual fervor was waning, when corruption and materialism had seeped into many corners of ecclesial life. To gather funds for his building project, Francis sold some of his father's fabric and a horse, hoping to use the money to buy materials for San Damiano. When Pietro discovered this unauthorized sale, he was livid. The conflict between father and son erupted violently. Pietro accused Francis of theft, of squandering the family's resources, and he dragged him before the Bishop of Assisi to demand restitution. Francis neither wavered nor cowered. In the courtyard before the bishop, amid a gathering of townspeople, Francis took off all his fine clothes and handed them back to Pietro, standing there in nothing but his undergarments. In a gesture that was both dramatic and symbolic, he declared that he now had only one Father, "Our Father, who art in heaven." The bishop, startled by this display, hurried to cover Francis with his own cloak. Pietro was speechless, his face burning with anger and shame. The crowd whispered among themselves, some calling Francis a madman, others seeing in his act a courageous renunciation. Pica, heartsick at the wedge driven between her husband and her son, could only pray that God would watch over Francis. In that moment, Francis effectively severed ties with his old life. He renounced his inheritance and his claim to the wealth of his family. He embraced poverty, carrying nothing more than the simple garb given to him, trusting that the Lord would provide. Thus began the strange, wondrous, and often difficult path that would lead Francis to become a reformer of hearts and a beacon of evangelical fervour. Freed from concern over money, Francis set about repairing San Damiano with his own hands. He begged for stones from builders, carried them on his back, and painstakingly rebuilt the crumbling walls. Some who passed by ridiculed him, calling him the stone gatherer. Others, seeing his zeal, began to consider the possibility that he was a holy fool, driven by faith rather than pride. Francis worked cheerfully, finding joy in the simple labour, giving thanks whenever he found a loose stone or when someone donated a bit of mortar. But San Damiano was only one such task. There were other chapels in need of repair. Francis took them on as well: San Pietro della Spina, Santa Maria degli Angeli, the Porziuncola, and others. Slowly, his devotion grew more intense. He spent hours in prayer, often outdoors, contemplating the crucified Christ and the infinite love that such sacrifice represented. He was enthralled by the mystery that God would choose to become man, to suffer, to die in such poverty. The humility of Christ set the model for Francis's own life choices. He resolved to live as Christ lived, wandering, poor, preaching love and repentance wherever he might go. He began to dress in a rough tunic tied with a cord. This was no official religious habit at first, merely the simplest garment he could find. He walked barefoot or in worn sandals. He begged for his daily sustenance. He spoke kindly to everyone, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest beggar. Some laughed, assuming he was a lunatic. Others, touched by his sincerity, wondered if perhaps his madness was a kind of divine folly. He was not eloquent in a scholarly sense. He had not studied rhetoric or theology at a formal level, but he spoke from the heart, quoting simple lines from the Gospels. He would say, "Love the Lord with all your heart, and love your neighbour as yourself," repeating this in various ways, illustrating it with stories or by his own actions of kindness, and hearts began to stir. One by one, other young men were drawn to join him. The first was a friend named Bernardo de Quintavalle, a wealthy citizen of Assisi, who was intrigued by Francis's transformation and the peace radiating from him. Bernardo invited Francis to stay in his home one night. As Bernardo feigned sleep, he watched Francis pray throughout the darkness, quietly repeating, "My God and my all." In that simple phrase, Bernardo perceived a depth of devotion that unmasked the shallowness of his own pursuits. By morning, he decided to follow Francis. Others soon followed: Pietro Catani, a judge who left behind his legal career; Giles, a labourer who wanted nothing more than to serve God wholeheartedly. The band of brothers began to grow, though they had no formal rule, no recognized status in the church, no worldly possessions. They lived in huts near the Porziuncola, the small chapel that Francis had helped to restore, dedicating their days to prayer, manual work, and the care of lepers, those outcasts who roamed the outskirts of towns, covered in sores, avoided by all. Francis had discovered a special calling to serve lepers, recalling how once he had been revolted by their mere smell. Overcoming that revulsion was for him a sign of grace. He not only tended to them, but embraced them, kissed their wounds, seeing in them the hidden face of Christ. In those earliest days, Francis and his companions wandered through the countryside, preaching repentance and love. Their message was simple: follow the teachings of Jesus as closely as possible, renounce unnecessary possessions, live joyfully in the knowledge of God's love, and be at peace with all. Their garb was humble, their demeanour kind, and their words full of conviction. Crowds began to gather, attracted by their sincerity and Francis's radiant joy. Noblemen, peasants, monks, nuns, children, people of all classes wanted to listen to this ragged preacher who spoke of God's tenderness in such a way that it stirred hearts to tears and laughter. Some scoffed, calling Francis and his companions fools. But others found in their simple way of life a living gospel, a rediscovery of something vital. Eventually, Francis realized that if this brotherhood was to endure and grow, it needed some form of official recognition. He gathered his companions, 12 in number, and together they travelled to Rome to petition Pope Innocent III for permission to live according to a rule based on the Gospels. This was a bold step. They arrived in Rome dusty and footsore, dressed in their worn tunics. They were a stark contrast to the splendor of the papal court, filled with bishops and cardinals in rich vestments, the marble halls echoing with the sound of formal ritual. Initially, the papal court was skeptical. Some advised Innocent III to dismiss the group as a bunch of zealots, a potential source of disturbance. Yet there was something about Francis, his humility, his unwavering faith, that touched the Pope. According to one account, Innocent III had a dream in which he saw a small figure in peasant garb holding up the crumbling Lateran basilica on his shoulders. When Francis and his brothers arrived, the Pope recognized the small, humble figure from his dream. This gave him pause. After some discussion, Innocent III granted them oral permission to live their form of life, preaching penance, on condition that they remain loyal to the Church and respect ecclesial authority. He did not formally approve a written rule at this point, but it was a major step. Francis's fraternity was now recognized. They were frati minori, the lesser brothers, though soon people would call them the friars minor. Jubilant, Francis and his followers returned to Assisi, continuing to live in poverty and brotherhood. Their numbers grew rapidly. Men from all walks of life, sons of nobles, peasants, clerics, flocked to join them. Women, too, were moved by Francis's message. Among them was a young noblewoman named Clare, who would become one of Francis's closest spiritual friends. She renounced her inheritance, fled her home by night, and received the religious habit from Francis, beginning the community that would become known as the Poor Ladies of San Damiano, later called the Poor Clares. Like Francis, Clare embraced absolute poverty and a contemplative life of prayer, devoting herself to Christ with unwavering devotion. Though the growth of the fraternity was exhilarating, it also posed challenges. How were they to maintain unity? How to provide for the basic needs of so many brothers without betraying their vow of poverty? Francis insisted they live by working with their hands or by begging when necessary, never storing up excess goods. For him, absolute trust in providence was paramount. He believed that just as God clothed the lilies of the field, so would he care for those who surrender everything. And indeed, in many small, everyday miracles, they found sustenance. Someone would donate bread, just as they were about to go hungry, or a vineyard owner would let them glean grapes for free. Francis's relationship with nature also began to manifest during these years. He took delight in the beauty of the fields, the birds in the sky, the sun and moon, even calling them brother and sister. He saw creation as a grand tapestry reflecting the love of its maker. This poetic sensitivity would later find expression in the Canticle of the Creatures, in which he praises God through all elements of creation, addressing brother sun, sister moon, brother fire, sister water, and so on. People noticed this gentleness in him. Once, when he was preaching to a crowd, birds gathered around and seemed to listen. He concluded his sermon by telling the birds to praise their Creator, and they took flight in a fluttering dance, as if in a kind of avian applause. Yet Francis was not merely a lover of animals and flowers. He was a man deeply marked by the sign of the cross. He spent nights in prayer, sometimes weeping for the sins of humanity. He visited leper hospitals regularly, cleaning wounds and offering words of comfort. His body grew thin from fasting and continual travel. His face, once bright with youthful revelry, now shone with a spiritual ardor that could soften even the hardest hearts. In him, people saw reflected the Christ he proclaimed, a Christ poor, humble, and filled with compassion for all. Over time, the message of Francis began to spread beyond Assisi, throughout Italy, and eventually further. Brothers journeyed to distant regions, eager to share the gospel in Francis's style, living simply and seeking to bring peace. This momentum would eventually reshape monastic life throughout Europe, introducing new models of mendicant orders that embraced poverty as a means to connect more intimately with the common folk. The seeds Francis planted were beginning to take root in ways he himself could scarcely envision. Yet with growth came trials. Francis was not a trained administrator, nor did he particularly wish to be. He longed to remain the simple friar, praying and proclaiming God's love wherever he went. But as more brothers joined, organizational questions arose. Some wondered whether the ideal of absolute poverty was too extreme, arguing that the order should own property to house and care for the brothers. Others suggested modifications to Francis's strict rule. Caught between his fervor and the practicalities of a large and growing organization, Francis wrestled with doubts and pressures he had not anticipated. Around this time, Francis felt called to travel to the Holy Land, believing that preaching to the Muslims there could bring peace and reconciliation. He made attempts at journeys, going by ship, but storms and circumstances forced him to turn back. Eventually, during the Fifth Crusade, he would indeed travel to Egypt, where the Crusader army was besieging the port city of Damietta. But this lay in the future. For now, his desire to preach beyond Christian lands foreshadowed a bold dimension to his mission, that all might hear the gospel, regardless of barriers of culture or creed. In the midst of these emerging challenges, Francis remained steadfast in his love for God and neighbor. He continued to rebuild churches literally and figuratively. Every stone he placed, every leper's wound he cleaned, every sermon he preached carried the sincerity of a man who had forsaken all for the sake of divine love. The people who encountered Francis found themselves confronted by a living embodiment of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the merciful. And so, despite the skepticism of some, his influence grew, and a wave of renewal began to ripple through the church and society. He stood upon the hillside one evening, the sun setting beyond the valley, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Dressed in his tattered tunic, he breathed the cooling air and gazed upon the fields. Memory rushed upon him of his youthful escapades, the lavish clothes he once wore, the banquets he once hosted. How distant that all seemed, how small compared to the grandeur of God's love. His heart brimmed with gratitude. This was the life he had been seeking, though he had not known it. Freedom from the chains of possessions, a direct communion with creation, and a simplicity that allowed him to embrace the gospel without compromise. He whispered a prayer for the world, that others might also find such joy, and resolved to continue his mission of repairing God's house wherever it might be found in disrepair. He did not know then how many more trials would come, how many more miracles and heartaches, how many souls would be moved by his example, nor how his body would one day bear the very wounds of Christ. That was still to come. For now he was simply Francis of Assisi, clad in a poor tunic, with a heart aflame in love, setting forth along the narrow path of the gospel. And though he would be called a fool by some and a saint by others, his aim remained the same, to serve his Lord in perfect joy, no matter what befell him. He did not know then how many more trials would come, nor how many more would join him in that exhilarating risk of trusting the God who clothes the lilies. But the days that followed revealed something of the future. People from towns near and far traveled to see this ragged band, to hear Francis preach with disarming sincerity. His words were never long or complicated. Sometimes he spoke with a trembling voice, especially when recalling the sufferings of Jesus. Yet there was a luminous quality in his tone, a clarity that could hush the most restless crowd. People would stand, some leaning on walking sticks or holding tired children in their arms, listening in rapt attention as Francis urged them to turn back to God's love, to strip away greed and hatred, to give and to forgive. When he finished, it was not uncommon to see tears glistening on cheeks that had long been dry. The simplicity of this preaching and the radical way it was carried out drew both admiration and criticism. Some local priests, worried by the constant references to absolute poverty, whispered that Francis was challenging the legitimacy of church properties. Others, especially members of the bishop's household, maintained a watchful eye, for the church hierarchy would not tolerate a rebel who stirred up sentiments against ecclesial authority. Yet Francis never criticized the Church in a spirit of rebellion. Quite the contrary, he loved Holy Mother Church and insisted that his brothers show respect to bishops and priests, since they were the ones who administered the sacraments. If Francis pointed to corruption or excess, he did so in a voice of humble sorrow, not of condemnation. He believed that the only way to reform others was first to reform one's own heart, and the unspoken witness of his life was more potent than any scolding homily could be. Through the Umbrian hills he wandered, accompanied by a few of his earliest companions, weaving in and out of small towns. Sometimes they travelled in pairs, sometimes in groups. They would knock on doors, ask for a crust of bread or a little water, and in return offer help, sweeping a courtyard, mending a fence, or caring for the sick. The more they gave of themselves, the more they seemed to receive an inner joy. This joy was a kind of secret, born of renunciation, that the world could hardly comprehend. People saw them walking barefoot over rocky paths, wearing patched tunics in the dead of winter, singing hymns to God in voices bright with gratitude. Some called them saints, others called them fanatics, but no one could deny their authenticity. It was during these meandering journeys that Francis's love for nature intensified. He would pause beneath a tree, press his hand against its trunk, and marvel that God would create such a living being, offering shade and bearing fruit with no payment but the sun's warmth. Birds had always interested him, but now he addressed them as sisters and brothers in the grand family of creation. On many occasions he would preach outdoors, asking even the animals to join in praising their Creator. People recounted tales of how the wild creatures seemed strangely at ease around him, as though they sensed his spirit harbored no threat. There is a famous story of how he tamed the wolf of Gubbio, which had been terrorizing the town. According to this account, Francis approached the wolf, made the sign of the cross, and addressed it as Brother Wolf, explaining that its violence was causing fear and suffering. He then gently coaxed the wolf to accept a pact. The townspeople would feed it regularly, and in return it would no longer attack man or beast. Whether one regards the story as literal or symbolic, its moral rings true to Francis's conviction that all creation, wolf and man alike, could find harmony under God's care if only hearts were softened by love. As the number of friars increased, a kind of spontaneous order developed. Francis had written a short form of life based on the Gospels, urging his brothers to follow the teaching and footprints of our Lord Jesus Christ, living without possessions, observing chastity, and submitting to the Church's authority. Yet there was still no formally approved rule in writing, merely the papal recognition that they could preach penance. Even so, the fraternity spread. Brothers established small hermitages or simple huts throughout Italy, always returning to Assisi as a kind of spiritual home base. New recruits arrived from Bologna, Florence, Rome, and beyond, each drawn by the purity of Francis's vision. These expansions brought organizational headaches. Some of the new friars had studied theology at universities. They were accustomed to structure and scholarship. They valued the gospel ideals, but felt that the fraternity should establish a more concrete plan for educating novices, for ensuring a stable living, and for preserving the community over time. Francis, while not hostile to learning, worried that too much reliance on worldly wisdom or too much accumulation of books could erode the radical dependence on divine providence. He reminded them that Christ had sent the apostles forth without extra tunics or bags of gold. Yet with swelling numbers came practical realities that could not be dismissed. In quiet moments, Francis found himself torn between his desire to remain the little poor man of Assisi, wholly free from bureaucratic entanglements, and the need to guide an ever larger flock. Around this time, another group began to form: devout lay people, men and women who were inspired by Francis but could not leave their families or occupations to join his wandering life. They sought a way to live in the spirit of Francis, maintaining their responsibilities in the world while embracing a more prayerful, charitable way of life. Eventually, this would blossom into what is now known as the Third Order, providing a path for lay people to adopt Franciscan ideals. Francis accepted them with open arms, seeing it as one more sign that God was at work beyond the little circle of friars. There was also Clare of Assisi, whose community of women at San Damiano grew into the Order of Poor Ladies, later known as the Poor Clares. Their life was even more secluded, devoted to prayer and strict poverty. Clare, gentle yet firm in her own convictions, became a mirror of Francis's spirituality, showing how the same ideals of poverty and dedication could be lived in a monastic enclosure. Whenever Francis visited San Damiano, he found Clare's resolve both inspiring and challenging. She refused to compromise on the vow of total poverty, even when church authorities suggested that nuns might accept certain endowments for their financial security. Her devotion strengthened Francis's own resolve, reassuring him that his radical path was indeed shared by others called to the same spirit. Meanwhile, in the wider world, Pope Innocent III had died, and the papacy had passed through a series of transitions, eventually to Honorius III. Crusader fervor still gripped Europe, with calls to reclaim the Holy Land from Islamic control. Francis felt a profound longing to bring the message of Christ's love even to the so-called enemies of Christendom. He harbored no illusions that he could single-handedly end the Crusades, but he believed in the power of peaceful presence and genuine dialogue. On more than one occasion, he tried to set sail for distant lands. Early attempts ended in storms or illness, forcing him to turn back, but he remained convinced that God would one day open a door. That door opened in 1219 during the Fifth Crusade in Egypt. Francis, accompanied by a small band of friars, made his way to the Crusader camp near Damietta on the Nile Delta. The scene was grim, soldiers besieging the city walls, the stench of disease and death hovering in the air. Francis was appalled by the carnage on both sides. Soldiers told him he was mad for wanting to cross enemy lines. But Francis insisted that if the Sultan al-Malik al-Kamil heard the truth of the gospel in a spirit of peace, perhaps some good would come of it. At best, the Sultan might convert. At the very least, maybe bloodshed could be lessened. The Crusader generals scoffed, but Francis secured permission to try. With one companion, he walked directly into the Muslim camp, praying with each step. By a miracle of God or by the curiosity of the Sultan, Francis was not killed. Instead, he was brought before al-Malik al-Kamil, a man known for his learning and cultured demeanor. Accounts of their meeting differ in details, but the essence is that Francis spoke sincerely about God's love. Some say he even proposed a trial by fire to prove the truth of Christianity, though that might be more legend than fact. What is clear is that the Sultan treated Francis with respect, was moved by his courage, and allowed him to remain for a while in the camp. They conversed as best they could through interpreters, neither converting the other, yet parting on friendly terms. The Sultan, impressed by Francis's earnestness and humility, gave him safe passage back to the Christian lines, possibly along with certain tokens of esteem. Francis left the encounter convinced that kindness and open-hearted dialogue could bridge even the most hostile divides. He returned to Italy and found that his growing order had taken on a life of its own. The friars had gathered in what was called a chapter, a meeting where decisions about the community were made. Many new brothers had joined, some of whom had never even met Francis. The ideals of strict poverty and absolute simplicity were being questioned by some, who felt the need for practical measures, owning a few houses for novices, establishing formal studies, accepting donations for sustenance. Others were determined to preserve Francis's original radical ideal, refusing any compromise. In the midst of this tension, Francis felt overwhelmed. He was a man of prayer, not a politician. He saw how sincere brothers on both sides were trying to do what they believed was best for the order. Nevertheless, the Church demanded a written rule, something with canonical approval. Francis set about formulating a rule of life that would be acceptable both to his own conscience and to the Curia. The first draft was lengthy and heartfelt, filled with passages from the Gospel and exhortations to live humbly. When he presented it, some of the cardinals and even some friars found it too impractical. He tried again, seeking the help of trusted companions like Brother Leo and Brother Benizo. Together they refined the text, removing some of the more poetic flourishes to make it more concise. In 1223, Pope Honorius III finally approved the definitive rule of the Friars Minor, which upheld poverty and simplicity while granting enough structure for the rapidly expanding community. Francis accepted this formalization as necessary, though his spirit yearned for the unencumbered freedom of the earliest days at the Porziuncula. Shortly after this approval, Francis, worn down by illness, felt the desire to withdraw more often for solitude and prayer. The demands of leadership weighed heavily on him. He had little energy for administrative squabbles. At times he found relief in climbing the slopes of Mount La Verna, a rugged place given to the friars by a nobleman who admired Francis. There, amid the caves and towering pines, Francis sought communion with God in silence, listening to the wind, reciting psalms, and contemplating the mystery of the crucified Christ. It was on La Verna, in the year 1224, that an event of mystical significance took place. Francis received the stigmata, the wounds of Christ in his hands, feet, and side. The precise nature of how this happened remains a mystery. Witnesses reported that Francis had been praying with intense fervor, asking to experience in his body and soul the depth of Christ's passion while still being permitted to live in love. One morning, a vision of a seraph, an angelic being aflame with divine love, appeared, bearing the likeness of the crucified. When the vision departed, Francis found his hands and feet pierced as if by nails, and a wound in his side as if by a lance. Blood seeped from these wounds, yet they did not fester in the usual manner. Their presence caused him pain, and yet also a profound spiritual joy. He tried to keep them hidden, humbly aware that others might venerate him for what he considered only a sign of God's grace. But the wounds were real, and the friars who assisted him noticed the bandages he wore and the marks on his flesh. Word spread, and many began to regard Francis as a living image of Christ. This deeply embarrassed him, for he wished to remain nothing, a mere sinner saved by grace. From that point forward, Francis's physical health deteriorated. He suffered not only from the pain of the stigmata, but also from eye diseases and other ailments likely caused by years of malnutrition, exposure, and ceaseless travel. He became almost blind, often in severe discomfort, yet his spirit remained undimmed. He composed the Canticle of the Creatures around this time, praising God through Brother Sun, Sister Moon, Brother Wind, Sister Water, Brother Fire, and Sister Mother Earth. In the final verses, he added praise for Sister Bodily Death, urging acceptance of our mortality as part of God's plan. Even in sickness, even with fading eyesight, he sang with childlike wonder at the glory of creation. As he felt life slipping away, Francis asked to be brought back to the Porziuncula, the little chapel of Santa Maria degli Angeli that had witnessed the birth of his vocation. He wanted to die in utter poverty, close to the place he had loved so dearly. The friars carried him there, laying him on the bare ground. In those last days, he blessed his companions and exhorted them to love Lady Poverty, to be faithful to the gospel, and to remain obedient to the Church. He warned them not to water down the rule, not to let power or possessions creep into their lives, and he assured them of his prayers, promising that he would continue to intercede for them from heaven. He asked that a simple tunic be placed upon him. Then, praising God and singing snatches of the canticle, he breathed his last on the evening of October 3rd, 1226, at about 44 years of age. The friars wept, Clare and her sisters grieved in their cloister, and the townspeople of Assisi mourned the passing of the city's cherished son. But even in their tears, they felt the consolation that the poverello, little poor man, was now fully united with the Christ he had loved so passionately. According to tradition, larks, his favorite birds, gathered in the sky, singing in the twilight as if escorting his soul to eternity. News of his death spread rapidly throughout Italy and beyond. Miracles were soon reported at his tomb. Pope Gregory IX, who had known Francis personally, moved swiftly to canonize him in 1228, a mere 2 years after his passing. A grand basilica was commissioned in Assisi, built in 2 levels, to house his remains and welcome the countless pilgrims who flocked to honor the new saint. Workmen, artisans, and some of Italy's greatest painters, later including Giotto, would adorn the basilica with frescoes depicting Francis's life, from his youthful frivolity to his embracing of a leper to receiving the stigmata. The images told a story that words alone could scarcely capture. The conversion of a soul set ablaze by divine love, the forging of a path that renewed the Church's spirit. In the centuries that followed, the Franciscan order continued to expand across Europe and in time to the far reaches of the globe. It branched into various families, each interpreting Francis's vision in slightly different ways, some more austere, some more pastoral, some focused on missionary work. Disputes arose, reforms took place, popes intervened, but the foundational charism that Francis had handed on endured, living the gospel in humility, simplicity, and love for all creation, especially the marginalized. Yet none of that, neither the grand basilica nor the international institutions, would have mattered to Francis nearly as much as the quiet, daily acts of love by which people encountered Christ. In his life, he had sought to repair a church in ruins, not so much by critique as by example, not by grand theories, but by concrete acts of service, prayer, and fraternity. He had discovered that giving oneself away in love, embracing the cross of Christ, was the most direct route to joy. That joy became contagious, so that noblemen, peasants, and even bishops found themselves longing for a taste of it. Francis was, in many ways, the troubadour of God, a joyful minstrel traveling from place to place, singing a song of love and penance, reminding the world that holiness was not a burden, but a liberation. Even centuries later, his example continues to captivate. People of all faiths or no faith at all look upon his life and find in it a purity that transcends cultural divisions. He cherished the poor and the leper, broke bread with the outcast, conversed amicably with a Muslim sultan, embraced the beauty of every living thing. In an age often marked by greed or conflict, he stood as a radiant contradiction, living proof that there is another way, the way of the Beatitudes. It was that same contradiction that shaped the final moments of his earthly sojourn. Francis, dying in the place where his vocation had first taken flight, stripped of all possessions except love, returned his spirit to the one who had breathed life into him. No palace or royal tomb awaited him, only the humble portiuncula, and later the collective reverence of those who recognized that a saint had walked among them. In the hush that followed his passing, one could almost hear his echo, "My God and my all." With that phrase, Francis had long ago surrendered everything, and in doing so, he had gained everything worth having. Such was the paradoxical life of Francis of Assisi, the merchant's son who renounced wealth, the man of peace who ventured into war-torn lands, the fool for Christ who reformed the church, the lover of nature whose wounds mirrored those of the crucified. He was and remains a saint for every age, calling from across the centuries for hearts to be softened, eyes to be opened, and hands to be extended to the least among us. And in that call, the legacy of Francis continues, as vibrant as the sunlit hills of Umbria, where he once roamed, singing praises to the Lord of all creation. Yet to leave his story here would be to miss some of the most touching events that followed immediately after his death, as well as the ripple effects that slowly but steadily transformed not just Italy, but the broader world. For Francis's influence did not vanish when he closed his eyes. Indeed, it only grew. Pilgrims from all over Europe began to make their way to Assisi, drawn by rumors of miracles at his tomb. Many carried ill loved ones or came burdened by guilt and sought healing. The friars welcomed them, offering prayers and recounting stories of Francis's life. Testimonies gathered like the swollen waters of a river after a heavy rain, each tale adding weight to the conviction that Francis was interceding from heaven. Some claimed physical healings, lameness cured, blindness reversed, while others spoke of conversions of heart, renewed faith, or unexpected reconciliations in families once torn by strife. Pope Gregory IX, having known Francis personally from the days when, as Cardinal Ugolino, He had supported the nascent order, wanted to ensure that the saint's message reached every corner of Christendom. After the speedy canonization in 1228, the construction of the Basilica of Saint Francis began. It was a monument unlike any other, intended not to glorify wealth, but to testify to Francis's life and mission. When the lower church was completed enough to receive Francis's remains, there was a solemn procession through the streets of Assisi. Citizens who remembered the young, carefree Francis, the king of revels, stood beside new converts who had never met him in person but felt they knew his heart through the stories. Bells tolled and tears were shed, as if the city were placing her favorite son in a final resting place worthy of the holiness he had embodied. Inside the basilica, Francis's tomb soon became an epicenter for devotion. The friars there felt the tension between the grandeur of the edifice and Francis's own love for simplicity, but they reasoned that many souls would be touched by the art and the liturgies celebrated in that sacred space. Over the years, frescoes by Cimabue and then Giotto would adorn the walls, depicting the life of Francis in vivid narrative panels. His renunciation of worldly goods, the vision of the crucifix at San Damiano, the preaching to the birds, the stigmata on Mount La Verna. Thousands upon thousands of pilgrims would stand in awe beneath those painted scenes, absorbing the gospel values that Francis so clearly demonstrated in his own life. From Assisi, Franciscan missionaries set forth to every corner of Europe and beyond. They traveled to Germany, France, Spain, England, and eventually as far as the Americas once the age of exploration began. In each locale, they strove to live simply among the people, preaching, teaching, caring for the sick. They brought a dimension of popular ministry that complemented the more established monastic traditions. While Benedictine monasteries offered stability, learning, and hospitality, the Franciscans brought a more itinerant presence to the highways and byways, meeting people where they lived. Their emphasis on poverty served as a constant challenge to societies increasingly tempted by luxury and power. Nor was the Franciscan influence limited to the friars alone. Clare's monastery in Assisi inspired similar communities of women across Europe, each dedicated to prayer, poverty, and charity. Meanwhile, the Third Order of Saint Francis spread rapidly among lay people. Farmers, merchants, knights, and nobles who, while remaining in their stations of life, pledged to live by Franciscan values: simplicity of heart, detachment from excessive wealth, works of mercy, daily prayer. Such lay fraternities became a channel for the gospel in daily settings, leaven in the dough of society. Even in the midst of medieval feudal structures, these lay Franciscans found ways to soften the hardships of the poor, care for the sick, and promote social justice. As the decades passed, tensions arose within the Franciscan family regarding fidelity to the strict poverty that Francis had lived and the practicality of owning convents or universities. Some friars wished to adhere rigidly to the founder's austere practice, refusing even the collection of alms in certain forms. Others argued that to effectively preach and educate, one needed stable foundations and libraries. This debate would flare into controversies, leading to various reforms and splits over the centuries, such as the observants and conventuals, each group claiming to preserve the true spirit of Francis. Historians would later examine these disputes as evidence of how a charismatic founder's ideals become subject to institutional complexity. Yet through all these debates and reforms, Francis's original example never ceased to shine as a point of reference, a challenge to worldly compromise. In artistic and literary spheres, Francis's legacy also blossomed. His Canticle of the Creatures is credited by many scholars as the first piece of literature in the Italian vernacular. In it, he praises God through the elements of nature in a language so simple and direct that common people could understand it without the mediation of Latin. This helped shape the development of Italian as a literary language. Later poets and writers would draw inspiration from Francis's mystic love of creation, weaving themes of cosmic praise into their own works. In a time when art often focused on fear of judgment or veneration of distant saints, Francis's approach emphasized God's immanence and the goodness of the created world. an attitude that resonated through centuries of spiritual writing. The broader church recognized in Francis a herald of reform that aligned with Christ's own poverty and compassion, thus paving the way for other mendicant orders, notably the Dominicans founded by Saint Dominic. Between Francis and Dominic, a new era in religious life took shape, marked by mendicancy, preaching, and direct engagement with the populace. This, in turn, revitalized spirituality across Europe. Francis's example also influenced saints of later ages. Catherine of Siena, who strove to reform the papacy; Ignatius of Loyola, who adopted certain Franciscan elements in founding the Jesuits; and even beyond Catholicism, Protestants like Martin Luther, who admired Francis's sincerity if not all his doctrines. Indeed, Francis stands as a rare figure whose sanctity has been acknowledged even by non-Catholics, drawn by his transparent authenticity. Over time, countless legends arose surrounding Francis, some more historical than others. Stories depicted him stopping a raging storm, healing the sick by mere touch, or conversing with angels in the forest of La Verna. While historians might question certain embellishments, the essence of Francis's sanctity remains indisputable. He was a man fully surrendered to grace, possessed by a love so intense that it remade him, body and soul, into a living mirror of Christ. The stigmata, whether or not someone believes it was physically supernatural, symbolized the depth of his union with the crucified one. For those who encountered Francis personally, or who study him centuries later, that authenticity is the crux of his impact. There was no gap between what he proclaimed and what he lived. In the course of history, the world has not always heeded Francis's message of peace and poverty. Wars have raged, wealth has accumulated in fewer and fewer hands, and the poor still suffer at the margins of society. Yet in every age, there have been people who rediscovered Francis's call, clergy, religious, and laity alike, who took up his mantle, sold their possessions, and went forth among the least of these. Missionaries who tended to lepers in far-flung missions, volunteers who feed the homeless in modern cities, environmental activists fighting to protect endangered species and habitats. Many of these draw inspiration from the figure who called even the worms in the road brother, and insisted on picking them up so they would not be crushed. And so, the vision of Francis remains a living force, perpetually stirring the conscience of believers and non-believers alike to cherish the poor, respect creation, and turn one's heart to God with childlike trust. The town of Assisi itself has become a place of pilgrimage and peace conferences, a meeting ground for interreligious dialogue, most famously under Pope John Paul II and subsequent popes who chose it as a symbol of unity and reconciliation. World leaders, spiritual figures from diverse faiths, and ordinary pilgrims gather there to pray side by side, inspired by the memory of a man who once ventured unarmed into a foreign land to speak with a sultan, hoping love could succeed where swords had failed. While the outcome of such initiatives may vary, the spirit of Francis seems to hover over the gatherings, reminding all present that peace is possible when hearts lay down the weapons of pride and division. One of the most striking contemporary signs of Francis's enduring influence is that in 2013, Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio chose the name Francis when elected Pope, the first time in history that a pope took that name. Pope Francis stated that he did so because he was moved by Francis of Assisi's concern for the poor and his desire for peace. This decision signaled a commitment to the same values of humility, simplicity, and solidarity with the marginalized that defined Francis's life. For many observers, Catholic and otherwise, it was a powerful testament to how Francis's witness still shapes the Church's self-understanding 8 centuries after his death. In the end, the story of Francis of Assisi is a narrative of transformation, of a restless young man awakened by grace, of a church revitalized by one man's radical fidelity to the gospel, and of countless individuals who found hope and purpose by following his example. It is a story so interwoven with divine mystery that it cannot be confined to mere dates and facts. Rather, it resonates as a living parable of conversion and joyful surrender. Each phase, his youth, his imprisonment, his conversion before the crucifix at San Damiano, his embrace of lepers, the formation of the friars minor, the meeting with the sultan, the reception of the stigmata, and his final hours on the bare ground of the Porziuncola, reflects a deeper lesson in the Christian life. We find our true selves only by giving ourselves away. Even now, in the quiet chapels of Assisi, a pilgrim might kneel before the same cross at San Damiano that spoke to Francis. Candles flicker, illuminating the face of Christ that once seemed to move and speak. Nearby, the simple stone walls still bear scars of age, an echo of the disrepair Francis was asked to mend. Outside in the courtyard, the sunlight might fall upon a small patch of green where birds peck at seeds, unafraid of human presence. And if one listens closely, perhaps in the hush of the heart, Francis's prayer still echoes. Most high, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart. Give me true faith, certain hope, and perfect charity, sense and knowledge, Lord, so that I may carry out your holy and true command. That is the essence of his life's work, to carry out God's command, which, in the end, is love. Love for the Creator, for the Son, for the Spirit. Love for the poor, the sick, the outcast, the stranger, the wolf, the bird, the flower, and all that breathes under the sun and moon. He made no distinction between spiritual duty and everyday kindness. For him, all was holy when offered in the name of Christ. And in that seamless garment of love, Francis found a joy that did not fade even under physical torment or the weight of organizational burdens. He died singing, praising God in creation, and left behind not a worldly inheritance of gold or titles, but a spiritual inheritance of incalculable richness. Those who read his story or walk in his footsteps today discover that Francis's way is not reserved for a chosen few, nor is it locked in medieval times. It is a living invitation to see the world anew, to embrace simplicity in the midst of complexity, to find happiness not in possessions but in grateful wonder, and to serve the poor in whom Christ is ever present. Indeed, to the degree that one imitates Francis's humble joy, one becomes part of the ongoing renewal of the Church and the world, and so his journey continues in every heart that hears the quiet summons, "Repair my house." At times, that house is a literal chapel in need of stone and mortar. More often, it is the inner temple of the human soul, cracked and leaking from fear, greed, or sorrow, yearning for the light of God's mercy. Or it is the wider church, which in every age must rediscover the simplicity of the gospel when weighed down by institutional excess. Or it is creation itself, groaning under the strain of exploitation, waiting for people to rise in loving stewardship. Francis's reply to the crucifix at San Damiano was immediate and wholehearted. He picked up stone, carried it on his shoulders, and rebuilt what lay before him. In doing so, he discovered that the real labor was on his own heart, rebuilding it from the rubble of vanity and pride. Only then could he help rebuild others, whether that meant serving lepers or guiding novices or standing unarmed before a sultan. Thus, though Saint Francis of Assisi passed from this world so many centuries ago, his mission endures. His footprints still lead through the streets of Assisi, along the roads of Umbria, across the fields where larks sing, and into the hearts of anyone who dares to love as he loved. The humble stone walls of San Damiano still stand in gentle witness, and the Porciuncola remains a small shrine encased within a larger basilica, reminding visitors that the greatest revolutions often begin in the humblest places. The cross of San Damiano and the stigmata speak of a man fully conformed to Christ, a man who found in utter surrender the path to unquenchable joy. In this way, the story of Francis is not merely historical nor merely theological. It is a compelling drama of transformation, laced with the enchantment of a soul truly alive in grace, and it stands as a testament that such a life is possible for any who would listen to that interior voice calling, as it once did to Francis. Go and repair my house, which, as you can see, is falling into ruin. His response was total, and from that totality sprang a renewal whose effects still shape the world. Across time and space, his echo remains, inviting each new generation to step beyond the confines of fear or greed and into the wide freedom of divine love, a freedom that Francis, the little poor man of Assisi, continues to sing about from the far side of death, accompanied by the larks in perpetual praise.